My name is Michael Kirsch. I am the Director of Research for the NWAPA 21 project and the American Credit System for LaRouchesupport.com. I wanted to give a series of classes on the theme of the American credit system versus the British Empire, because this is the context that has defined the world since the crushing of the Massachusetts Bay Colony all the way through to the present day, 2013. And within this fight, the foremost issue that has defined whether or not the United States and sovereign nation states progress in contrast to the oligarchical system and the financial control that it wields on the world is whether or not the sovereign principle of credit is in action. Now, LaRouchepack.com has spearheaded the fight for Glass-Steagall, which is taking back the U.S. government, crushing the control by the international oligarchy over the means of production, over the means of food production, the means of manufacturing, and chiefly the financial system. What it really is crushing their control, taking the reins. But when you come in and you, as a new government that's going to have power once we put Glass-Steagall in, what we're really going to be doing is we're going to be coming in, asserting authority to then enact the purpose of sovereign nation state government, which is building the nation. And what that means is setting up a system where you have, as Lyndon LaRouche went through just a few days ago in his recent Friday webcast, where the payment system has nothing to do with money. It has to do with the intention to make good physically in production, transportation, and technology. In other words, a credit system. So how the credit system is our legacy, without a doubt, is what I wanted to get across and develop as a further historical legacy for people. Because as we've put forward in our recent 3-point program pamphlet, you see that this is something that's not just starting with our Constitution. It was the key issue with the Constitution, but this goes back, no question asked, as the way that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was set up. And so while you can start with Hamilton and move forward all the way to the present day, including what we have to do now, you also, by going back and looking at the original foundation of this North America with the Winthrops and the Mathers through Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, you really get a sense with just the character, the true nature of the credit system, how it's intertwined with the sovereign nation state itself. That you don't have a nation without a credit system. You don't have a government without a credit system. And that's why right now, the failure to understand what a credit system is, and especially the fact that this is the American credit system, it means that we're really almost returning back into colonial status and, frankly, just feudalism, that you don't have nation states at all unless you have a credit system. So, ever more the importance to understand what this is. So, first of all, let me just say, before launching into the historical arc from 1650, that what we need to do right now is simply take, if you look at the U.S. economy, we've outlined here on the website, and Mr. LaRouche has outlined for quite some time, that you're looking at simply coming in as the authority of government and figuring out physically what do we have to do. How many skilled labor do we have? How many nuclear power plants do we need, right? I mean, we've got 19% of our electrical capacity is nuclear. John F. Kennedy said it was going to be 100% by 2000. We're far away from that. We need to immediately build the NWAPA 21 project, flood control, immediately desalinate water, as well as do whatever else we can in the short term, ionizing the air to increase condensation of water if that's possible. Desalinate like crazy with nuclear power across the coasts, West Coast, Texas, so that in the short term, in the next couple of years, if we lift these stupid regulations, which is actually 70% of the cost of a nuclear power plant, we could start getting immediate water and save our farms of the West. But then 15, 20 years, we get Nawapa built with advanced technologies, and a fast track, we can also put desalinated water into that system, and we can also use the runoff from the north and start reviving the U.S. economy. Now, how are you going to do that? Well, we've got to throw all of our skilled labor, all of our productive capacity, build new industries with the new nuclear power plants we're going to have to do. And what that needs is a payment system which is all based on the intention to make good on your productivity, the intention to make good on what the credit that you issue. So the payment system, that all between the industries and the financial system, you're going to have simply agreements and a financial system and a payment system which is all based on credit, all based on making good on the commitment, your original commitment. So the government's going to have to figure out exactly what our physical potential is, how much we can put it in motion, and step by step. And we're simply going to set up a Bank of the United States like Hamilton, and we're just going to figure out how much we need to invest, can invest right away, issue that credit, and it can be capitalized in a number of ways, and we can also just use the credit of the government. So how we're going to do that exactly is going to be drawing on some of these historical examples. So it's ever more important for people to understand what this historical process is. So then we'll proceed here on the historical arc. So what I want to look at first is that Alexander Hamilton looked back at when he set up the credit system initially, and it instituted that we had not colonial bills of credit for each colony and each state, but a single national intention that would follow through on the government's credit. He set up with the Constitution. He looked back in his final report before leaving the authority of Treasury Secretary with a report on public credit in 1795 by reviewing that idea in its entirety, because he came to realize that it was much beyond any mechanical one set up a bank of the United States or bills of credit, but it was a single principle of how we developed the country. And he says, no well-informed man can cast a retrospective eye over the progress of the United States from their infancy to the present period without being convinced that they owe in a great degree to the fostering influence of credit their present mature growth. This credit has been of a mixed nature, mercantile and public, foreign and domestic. Credit abroad was the trunk of our mercantile credit, from which issued ramifications that nourished all the parts of domestic labor and industry. Bills of credit emitted from time to time by the different local governments, which passed current as money, cooperated with that resource. Their united force quickening the energies and bringing into action the capacities for improvement of a new country was highly instrumental in accelerating its growth. So he's looking at that. The process really begins with John Winthrop Jr., who comes over here in 1631, following his father who'd come over a few years earlier, right? And the escape from the feudalism of Europe, the religious warfare from 1492 to 1648, and the inability to have any kind of general welfare government in Europe, as the failures had been there, brought real scientists, thinkers, and industrialists over. And John Winthrop Jr. was actually expert chemist. He studied desalination of water. He had papers on that, desalination of ocean water. He set up the iron mines in the United States. He set up Saugus Iron Works and going exploring new minerals. And he also had a proposal to set up a bank of credit. And one of the inspirations for that seemed to be a book in 1650 by William Potter, who I don't know that much about except the fact that he was given this book by William Potter by a man named Samuel Hartlieb, and they had a whole correspondence of what these various scientific discoveries and this bank plan that John Winthrop Jr. was going to submit to the Royal Society. And William Potter also apparently brokered a contract between Connecticut and Massachusetts when John Winthrop Jr. became the governor. So he was involved there. He had this book by William Potter, and the whole purpose of this book was, which is called The Key of Wealth, A New Way of Improving Trade. He says, in a humble fashion, he says that he discovered that all things which may be got for gold throughout this earth are obtainable in all respects as happily and effectually, though with some difficulty, tending as a great improvement of trade, as may serve to demonstrate the vanity not only of gold, but of all worldly wealth whatsoever. And so what he looks at is we have to look at increasing trade, increasing physical productivity of nations that don't have money. Now, people today don't think of money as gold and silver. They think of that as something you might collect, or it's a good. Gold bullion, it's a good that you just can transfer, buy and sell. But back then, all the money, the accepted currency, was gold and silver. So when people said money, they were thinking of gold and silver. Today you think of that as lawful money, dollars, a legal tender. But so people at this time, he's saying, we're going to figure out a way to not use money at all. We don't need money to improve trade. And he talks about how in nations where money is not hoarded but lent out in goods, houses, ships, lands, and goods far exceed the value of all the monies. Though money is not increased, yet by each man's endeavoring to keep his property in ships and multiplied in proportion, so by spending money in goods increases the circulation of overall wealth by trade itself. And he says, whether a nation have any silver amongst them, or no, yet if they can trade as well without, what need they care? For their estates in commodities is of as real value as if it were money. So what he was looking for is, he's saying, a security as good as money amongst men of trade. And he says, there is not at all any true worth in the best money or metal that this earth can afford, further than as being generally accepted for things of real value. So the only value of it is that people will give you other things for it. It gives to him that so accepts thereof security for obtaining some other commodity of like or greater value. If matters can possibly be ordered so as anything else besides money may give as good a security, it must needs in all respects be as good as money. So, knowing that without money at that time, men cannot receive a greater quantity of things, but if the object is to have improved, increasing trade, he said, admit thereof that several tradesmen of known and sufficient credit do cause a certain number of bills to be printed, and putting a value upon them, do lend the said bills to each other, upon no less security than if the same were so much ready money, or gold out of the mind, and bend themselves jointly to make good the same according to the terms following. So this is his setup. And what happened is John Winthrop Jr. got this book, and he writes in 1663 to the Royal Society proposals concerning a way of trade and banks without money. And he says that it could be brought into a practical way to the great advance of trade and answer all those ends that are attained in other parts of the world by banks of ready money. And there were land banks at the time where people would put their land out of commission and get money equal to it. And he said, I can do that without tying up the land. And he has his own credit plan, which is an unfound paper that's unavailable. But a year after he proposed this to the Royal Society, and he came back to the United States, or to, at this time, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, one of his associates, who was by marriage related, John Woodbridge, in 1664, proposed a similar idea to the colonial leadership. And in 1667, they adopted the plan, quote, credit pass and fund by book and bills will supply the defect of money. Because the 1652 pine tree shilling at this time had been frankly outlawed by the King of England. And he said, you can't coin your own money. I'm the ownership of the colony, and so you can't do that. So they were looking at a defect of circulating for trade, because the purpose was, as LaRouche went through in his webcast, this just last Friday, the purpose is to have a physical increase of productivity. So you have an increased means of payment between parties, which is then therefore simply a reflection of that intention to increase production, and you just figure out the way in which the credit between parties can serve as the currency. So it's making good on it, and the more that the government of the nation is committed to see it through, has the ability to organize through the powers of that government the resources of the whole, as we'll see with Hamilton, then the better certainty there will be on that credit. So this experiment was begun, and in 1671 it started, and a number of months and years, and then they formally started it again in 1681. And in the paper that John Woodbridge of Newbury had written, he says that this plan, this experiment, had passed the scrutiny above 30 years. And so you go back from 1681 to 1650, and you get back to William Potter, and this is the inspiration for this plan. And it's called Severals on the Fund. So what he writes in that is, he says that cash is but a ready conveniency, cash being considered here gold and silver, which has, through mistake, its esteem, not from the use, but intrinsic value, is not essential to a thing. Let me just start that out. He says, intrinsic value is not essential to a thing merely good for exchange, and serving barely to procure what one wants, that another abounds with. These bank bills, on the other hand, or payments therein, will affect to all intents as well as plenty of coin, which as money doth neither feed nor clothe. You can't feed people gold, nor clothe them with gold. Moreover, treasure not only allures an enemy, and is covetously hoarded up, and so like dung in a heap, unprofitable, but is also subject to wear, adulterating fires, robberies. People would cut parts of the coin, they call it sweating, and other things. Payments in this bank or bills issued thence are free from all these things. So this was an attack against gold and silver, which the oligarchies like to use to control the ability of a country for a long period. The complaint against it for on and on. So even when you finally had the destruction of our U.S. credit system under the Jackson administration, the people themselves continued to use the credit system, even though Jackson was imposing gold and silver, because of all the complaints of gold and silver as, frankly, an impossible, but also just the most inconvenient thing. But you could never move enough gold and silver around to have physical trade, which is why it ended up becoming 0.01% of all transactions in Hamilton's time and forever on after that. So this proposal saying we want this alternative to gold and silver or money was then put into the final form, and that was John Winthrop Jr. there on the left. I didn't mention that, but this is now his son, Waite Winthrop, who, amongst others in the colonies, leads up the institution after John Winthrop's death. John Winthrop Jr. dies in 1676, and so didn't get to see the full implementation of his credit system. But in 1686, his son Waite Winthrop, his nephew Adam Winthrop, Elijah Cook, William Stoughton, all guys who lead the charge to overthrow the royal governor Edmund Andros in 1689. In 1686, these guys push and set up a plan for a bank of credit. So there's this discourse on the bank of credit, which ends up being crushed when Andros comes in 1686, even though it's approved by the leadership of Boston in 1686. So this is the same issue. There's a scarcity of money. They say it seems necessary that something be set on foot because there's a present scarcity of money supply for carrying on ordinary commerce amongst traders, who, unless speedily relieved by this medium, will in all probability be exposed to ruin. So exact same language as you've seen with William Potter, John Winthrop Jr. They say a considerable number of persons of each trade agree voluntarily to receive ready monies and from each other and any persons in their ordinary dealings, bank bills of credit become diffused by mutual consent, passed from one hand to another, and so have at least equal advantages with the current monies of the country attending them, to all who become satisfied to be of this society. And you would put a flag on your business to show people that you accept those bills of credit. So you're basically creating an ulterior way of accelerating trade and commerce and manufacturers and industry and agriculture. And this was done initially on the idea that people would mortgage their land. So they had all this land. They didn't have any gold and silver. But then they can't trade with one another. So instead, they simply pledge their land together, and then they get these credit bills equal to the value of the land, and then they circulate those. And they didn't need any so-called capitalization. So they said these bank bills of credit were going to become legal money, legal tender. They put it in there, legal tender as payments to the government. And they give some examples of how this was going to work. That the shopkeeper now would pledge the value of his shop, for instance, or the miner the value of his mine. And he would pledge that to the bank and the group of people, and then he would receive these credit bills. Now he could pay his workers. And then his workers could go and they could buy things. For instance, the shopkeeper who now got credit could go to the merchant, and then the merchant who buys it, who also can then get bills from the shopkeeper, and the guys who go around and sell all the goods. Then the merchant can buy tar and fish and other manufacturers from the artificers, the manufacturers, and then those guys can also pay their rent, buy more cattle, buy more land, improve their land. And the mine worker can pay his workers, and as he gets metal from the mine, he can bring that to the bank and either pay the interest on the credit, or he can he can deposit his metal in the bank. So this was also a bank that was an industrial warehouse. So then there would be no idle capital. So there's no idle wealth. You're trying to magnify and accelerate any existing wealth so that you can increase productivity. You can make more and more credit available for other people and for the people themselves. So then you can also sell the metal at the warehouse. Instead of lying at their own private warehouse, you have a single place. So it was also that purpose, and that this is going to help the consumption of our own manufactures and other goods imported. No man that hath wherewith to buy will go naked and hungry. This helps to civilize the ruder sort of people and encourages others to follow example in industry and civility. So again, instead of, or I should say again in the sense that this was the arguments later on for credit. In Hamilton's time, you have idle people with money sitting around, versus that if you have credit, you're tied to the future, tied to the ability, to the ability to be productive and the necessity to be productive if you went in debt for something industrious. And there's a great back and forth in this bank where they have a Q&A, which is that this is such a foreign idea to some people that they don't want to go along with it. They say, well, I want my gold, my money. I say, well, what if I want money? Can I turn in my bank bills for money? And the answer says, the bank is not proposed to be a bank of money, but of credit, to be given forth by bills to supply such as cannot get money. But others who have money will take your bills. So other people who have money say, hey, this stuff is as good. I can see this stuff's going around. This is just as good as money in the sense that I'm going to be able to trade with this bill. So I'll give you some silver for that thing. And as people saw in history, the credit bills always ended up being worth more than the gold and silver as it was getting phased out because it was more secure, less cumbersome, less dangerous to use, and hadn't probably been cut into pieces. So this was a sovereign act, and it's clear in the conclusion of this bank proposal where they say that by the bank the trade and wealth of this country will be established upon its own foundation, and upon a medium or balance arising within itself, the lands and products of this country, and not upon the importation of gold or silver, or the scarcity or plenty of them, or anything else from foreign nations which may be withheld, prohibited, or enhanced at their pleasures. Our own native commodities will thus become improved to a sufficiency for our own use, at least, and thereby afford a comfortable subsistence to many ingenious and industrious persons amongst us, who know not at present how to subsist, and this will draw over more inhabitants and planters. It will not be in the power of any by extortion and oppression to make a prey of the necessitous. And this was, as Ben Franklin later says, the problem with a scarcity of money. He who has the money, therefore, can be usurious to others, which is what the empire was as a whole by keeping us without money and making us wear their clothing, since nobody had any money to pay their workers, so they had to pay all their money. They had to pay their workers in clothing. So we're dressed up as Europeans because that's how people were forced to be paid. That was just one example. But so this is a sovereign act. We're going to be dependent from the colony. And John Blackwell, who drafted it for the Winthrops, his name's on it and was found in the Winthrop papers around the turn of the last century. But it shows that the Bank of Credit was therefore in 1681 and 1687 when this paper was written, a century before the first real national attempt at banking with Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris and James Wilson. So this then gets us to Cotton Mather, who is a young man at the time that Edmund Andros is being overthrown. He's about 26 or 27, and he takes a lead in that fight. The royal governor Edmund Andros came in and tried to crush all of these developments, like this Bank of Credit, in 1686, the very year it was being discussed in Boston. So he's part of this team. He's a young man, but by 1690 he is leading up the colonial office in Massachusetts, writing the signing bills of credit that are issued to finance a failed expedition in Canada, up there to beat one of the French forts. So they end up issuing to pay the soldiers and tell everybody else, you accept those bills as legal tender because these soldiers, we have to pay them. And so we're going to pay for all the soldiers and other things we bought to these people, and you now have to accept them. And there's some people who have an outcry and say, well, I don't want to accept this bill of credit. So John Blackwell, who wrote the bank charter for and this whole plan with the Winthrops, and Cotton Mather come forward and write some considerations on bills of credit now passing in New England. And there's another one called Some More Consideration on Bills of Credit. So these papers, they outline that they make the point, silver we say we have not, credit we may have, and it will do as well if by this credit We permit our friends to command the same useful things as if they had ready silver in their hands. And Cotton Mather makes the point, what is the security of your paper money less than the credit of the whole country? This is in response to people not wanting to use it. What is it less than the credit of your whole country? If the country's debts must be paid, whatever change of government shall come, then the country must make good the credit. And then he says, I say, the country, and not the gentlemen who sign the bills and administer the government, all the inhabitants of the land, taken as one body, are the principals who reap the benefits and must bear the burdens, and are the security in their public bonds. What do the gentlemen get but their labor for their pains, the people of the country? So, like when you have a loan, you borrow something, you have the principal of the loan, right? And then you have the interest. He's saying the people, the inhabitants, are the principals. They're being pledged, and they're receiving the pledge from their own pledge. They're being pledged for making good on this. So the bills of credit, the country is saying we're going to make good. We're pledging that, this is be a medium where now there will be increased productivity, and now when taxes come in later, you can use those to pay us back. So we're going to pay for something based simply on our credit to make good later on. He says that this bill of credit is just as good as anything else. He makes the point is not discount in accounts current good pay. So if you have a debt to settle, and you're going to settle that in gold, what is any worse settling that debt by simply having your debt canceled? Do you have to receive the gold first and then go cancel your debt? Well, if you get bills of credit, you can cancel your debt. And this is why he then makes the point that money is but a counter or measure of men's properties, an instituted mean of permutation. He says, as metal is indeed a commodity, like all other things that are merchantable, but as money it is no more than what was said, a countermeasure, and had its origin from a general ignorance of writing and arithmetic. But now these arts, being commonly known as well, discharge money from the conceited necessity thereof in human traffic. So he says, look, when we didn't know arithmetic and mathematics, well, I guess we could be excused for having to use these pieces of metal, commodities, to trade with other commodities. But now, since we're learned men, we've grown up, we should realize that we don't need gold and silver at all. So here he is in 1690, which no government had ever made this point, shall we say, except the John Winthrop Jr. crew before him. But this is the first time that we're actually seeing the declaration to completely get rid of money as a object of necessity or desire to hoard up and say, now I've got the money. Because instead you simply balance credits with debts. So it's looking at keeping accounts between individuals and industries, and simply people going into debt to each other on the credit of increase in their productivity, increasing their productive powers of labor, as you see later on with Hamilton. And once you have that system set up with all the various parts of the economy, then the only necessity is to balance the credits with the debts. And that is exactly what Cotton Mather is saying all the way back when he says, is not discount in accounts current good pay? Are not taxes paid and received by mutual credit between the government and the people? And the government requiring the country to give them credit wherewith to pay the country's debts, and then again receive the same credit of the country as good pay. So he also attacks the people for falling into a Hobbesian worldview which says that there is no government, and that that's why they are not accepting the bills of credit. But if their heads weren't, he says, bewizzled with conceits that we have no government, there is no government, then we wouldn't be reduced to Hobbes, his state of nature, which says the strongest must sake all. So here you are in this period where the population is being terrorized by this overthrow, right, of James II. William of Orange comes in. He's asked to come over by agents that went to England from the Netherlands. The Venetian system is moving, and the population is terrorized here in the United States, or in the colonies and in England, to say, well, this is such a great thing going on. Now our whole former government, our charter, everything's delegitimized, and people were terrorized and saying there's no government at all. So here Cotton Mather and these guys are organizing the population against falling into this sense certainty old money system. And John Blackwell, as I said, the author of this other bank, he comes forward with a similar paper and says, "What is the use of coined silver but to furnish a man with credit, that he may obtain from his neighbors those commodities which he hath occasion for? The credit conveyed by these bills now circulates from one hand to another as men's dealings are, until the public taxes call for it. Shall not the government of the colony have as much credit with the people that choose all and make part of it? So shall not the government have credit with the people? People have credit with each other. How come the government can't have credit with the population as a whole?" So it is bringing people more and more to see in line that government can have a direct relationship with the economy as well, and that becomes an issue later on. So with Cotton Mather still alive, he dies in 1728, you have a continued series of credit bills issued by the colonies. And in 1716, there is a new paper, which Mather probably had a hand in, called Some Considerations on Several Sorts of Banks. And they make the point that we can just issue bills of credit now, again, to pay, not this time for a military adventure, but we can pay for people to set up a canal or a bridge. And then people can use that money later to pay taxes to the colony. It will become a legal tender. And they say that the government should emit large sums for promoting what may be beneficial and of a general good, right? For promoting the general welfare. So the government emit large sums for promoting what may be beneficial and of a general good, which will not only be a supply of present cash, but also lay certain and stable foundations of increasing the produce of the country, which is the interest and wisdom of all nations. So this is exactly what happens. And really, what I wanted to get across with this presentation, that all of these bills of credit that are issued, you see, they're simply reflections of the intention of these colonies to increase productivity. That every time they're issued for something which is going to increase productivity. And what that really means is it's going to decrease the costs of transporting goods from here or there, right, with a canal. Decrease the costs of production. Instead of buying it from England at high prices, they say, let us lend large sums upon good security without interest for some terms of years for building a bridge over the Charles River, cutting a channel for safe and more speedy passage of vessels, or setting up an iron finery. We have all this ore. Let's set up an iron finery which the help of which pots and kettles might be made here for the use of this country. And again, they say we need nails. We need a slitting mill to slit the iron into suitable rods, and at present we cannot make nails at an acceptable price, right? So we need to have an investment to set up a mill. If the country should give or lend a competent sum, that any shall procure workmen to bring such a mill to work to effect here, enable the smiths to make a sufficient supply of nails for this country. So the country is going to pledge its credit. So the country is going to simply say, we'll commit to this iron factory, and on our credit to later on tell you that you can, cancel your taxes by giving us those same bills of credit later on. So the country is just saying, we're committing ourselves to something. And that's the key issue with credit, is that you look at the last, since John F. Kennedy and the Congress, they don't want to commit to anything. So what it requires is commitment by a government. And that's frankly, the key issues, is just that if you're going to have a government that's going to issue bills of credit, is going to, we would not call them that these days, but is going to do something like this, it's going to have to see through over a long-term process. And especially right now, if you're going to have a country that's going to commit itself to a 20-year water project or immediate launching of nuclear power plants, desalination, what we need for farming, and so forth, it's going to have to commit itself all the way for this whole arc of time. So again, the country will commit to a project and then can be sure that the commitment by issuing the bills of credit will be profitable in the sense of physical profit, because you're going to increase productivity. So they say also, for this ironworks, if you commit to the sum of the bills of credit for a few hundred, it will save the country some thousands in a year. This one article of ironworks. And also they make the point that only the country can achieve certain things, right? Individuals by themselves could not achieve certain things. Only the country, they say, to have hemp and flax, if we want to produce our own sailboats here, we're going to have to, they say there is a great obstruction by the inability of many to break up land suitable for hemp and flax to sow. It would be good encouragement to lend them, these people, without interest, such a sum as may enable them to yearly break up and fence in 10 or 20 acres for that use. So, similar, we're going to set up storehouses and granaries. We should set that up, advance some thousands of pounds to set up granaries so that we can put all of our surplus grain in times of a great drought. So all these kinds of things is the reason why you're going to emit the bills of credit. And 4 years later, there's still this great lack of currency and means of exchange. There's another pamphlet called Some Proposals to Benefit the Province. And they say the only way out of the present troubles is to project some new medium of exchange. The great want of a medium of trade. Besides the gain proposed, is it not the glory and duty of authority to supply the province and uphold civil credit, without which trade must die? So Rhode Island is similarly pushing the bills of credit. And in 1716 and 1720 and 1724, they make the point that they actually kick out the guys that are opposed. And you have a whole succession of John Wanton, Samuel Wanton, I think it's his name, but there's a succession of father and son that run Rhode Island by issuing bills of credit. And they say that similarly, once again, in 1721, when they're issuing this, that they need to make up for a great scarcity and want of a proper medium of exchange. Trade and commerce, which are the nerves and power of government, are beginning to decline, stagnate, and decay. So what do? We need a hempen manufactory, we need a whale and cod fishery, and so we're just going to get a bunch of people together who will issue bills of credit on their land, for instance. And what they said is that the interest on this bills of credit that were out there, that people had to pay when they got a loan from the loan office, the interest was then allocated to improvements and enterprises for which they had originally emitted it. So they emit the bills of credit, and then the people who borrowed it, when they pay the interest, the government of the colony would put it aside to invest in these various things. They say here, for navigation, we never should have enjoyed this advantage had not the government emitted bills of credit to supply the merchants with a medium of exchange, always proportioned to the increase of their commerce. So you're putting out what you need. This is the proportion between how much medium of exchange you create is what you need for the commerce. Without this, we should have been in a miserable condition, unable to defend ourselves against an enemy or to assist our neighbors in times of danger. In short, if this colony be in any respect happy and flourishing, it is paper money and a right application of it that had rendered us so. And that the right application of it becomes important, because not in all cases did these bills of credit work because of the lack of coordination of colonial government power and a lack of just regulation of the physical economy. But for Ben Franklin, he had a very well-developed system, and he has a paper on the necessity of a paper currency in 1729. It reads like a real scientific document, and he shows how why the bills of credit that his colony, Pennsylvania, is going to emit will not decrease in value. But he makes the same point going all the way back, right, to 1650, William Potter, the Winthrops, that the a lack of a currency leads to high interest, it leads to decrease in value, it leads to people moving out because they can't actually produce anything, a return to feudalism, which is really the fight. Feudalism, creating, not able to create any new wealth, you're chained to the existing system, versus with the credit system, the nation state finding a way to move forward. So he makes the point, having currency increases trade, brings more people to the land, increases the value of the land, and therefore upholds the value of the currency in his case, because he's going to make the value of the currency based on a loan office where people mortgage their land. And that's essentially how these loan offices work. People would mortgage their property or their land and get a loan. So he says that, like Cotton Mather, money was the means of exchange, but it's not of any permanent value. More and more gold that a nation has, or silver in the banks, then the value of the currency goes up and down. So it fluctuates, whereas land, he should say the quantity of labor should be, as he gets to it here, he says, something is more requisite to fix. He says, but as silver itself is no certain permanent value, being worth more or less according to its scarcity or plenty, therefore it seems requisite to fix upon something else, more proper to be made a measure of values, and this I take to be labor. By labor may the value of silver be measured as well as other things. So the labor is what you're going to measure the value, and since he says really we're exchanging labor for labor, and that is the measure of value, he says if you have a guy making corn versus a guy making silver, digging up the silver, how long does it take a guy to make an ounce of silver versus how long does it take for a guy to make bushels of corn? That much corn is going to be the measure of value of that much silver. So the labor that went into making that much corn in the same amount of time that you got the silver, that's going to be what that silver is worth. So now when you get a more mine, you open up all these mines, but you haven't improved the technology of corn. All you've got is a lot more silver, and it's able to buy less corn, the same amount. So the money gets cheaper if you haven't increased the quantity of labor, and you're simply increasing the quantity of money. So he concludes there, thus the riches of a country are to be valued by the quantity of labor its inhabitants are able to purchase, and not by the quantity of silver and gold they possess. So his paper really develops why this is such a precise system that he's planning to set up. he says there will be so little danger of the sinking value of the currency. And as people buy back their land from the mortgage office, they're going to be taking money out of circulation. And that, therefore, then the land is going to go up in value over time. And so he has a whole thing on that, but you get a sense of that it was his intellect himself personally which made Pennsylvania's currency the best. And later on, Pennsylvania becomes the seat also of the Bank of the United States and the Philadelphia. And others praise his currency versus some of the other colonies that didn't manage it quite as well. And when you read his paper, you can find that out why exactly. So just the other point to make is that having a currency, he says, saves the time in which it takes to transport goods. So by barter, when you're wasting all this time trading commodities for other commodities, having money as a currency, he says, has additional value by the time and labor it saves in this exchange. So the worth of the paper currency versus the lack of money, or the worth of a paper currency versus the inconvenience of money, it makes that actually that much more valuable. So he's the one who brings this in. The time or labor is saved by introducing a sufficient currency and a sufficient paper currency. So you got to look at the value of actually just creating the paper currency inherent in having a medium of exchange. So what happens is he comes out the year after the Cotton Mather dies, 1728, and Ben Franklin's now taking up the leadership, and from this point on, I think he does, and even though he's a young man. But Jonathan Belcher, who's a royal governor appointed to come in and manage Massachusetts, right? Franklin's over in Pennsylvania, but he comes in, manages Massachusetts, and said no more bills of credit 1730. And he imposes a decline on the bills of credit of Massachusetts. And even though some of the other colonies keep printing bills of credit, so people have a means of exchange in Massachusetts, they make a call. The Assembly makes a call in 1739 for anyone who can furnish a further medium of trade in such a way and manner that the value thereof might be maintained. So you're getting this depreciating currency. There's not enough. There's too much from other colonies. And they're trying to figure out what the solution is. So as we get later on with Hamilton, people come forward with the plans from 1720 for their present day at that time. They say we're going to set up a bank. And they say we're going to set up a land bank. And the land bank says that it will authorize payment in certain articles of produce or manufacture into a scheme for encouraging home industry as well as a bank of issue on land security, and become known as the Land Bank and Manufacturing Scheme. So you can, again, get your bills payable 20 years later, and you can redeem them, pay the interest in the produce or the manufacturers enumerated in the scheme of the bank. So this bank would be loaning for development and manufacturing, and then as people produce things with their manufacturing, they're going to balance the credit in the bank later on. So it's your future productivity that's going to balance your past bills of credit emitted by the bank. And who is it? It's just people who have land all getting together, no capital at all, right? No, they're not putting gold and silver in the bank. It's the means for the notes. They're simply pledging their value of their land as the bank subscribers, and then it's issuing that much credit to pay all these workmen and all this stuff, and you get productivity going manufacturing. Because these people were just sitting around saying, we don't have the means of exchange, right, going all the way back to 1650. I mean, and today. But we don't have enough credit in circulation. We don't have enough means of exchange. So this gets totally axed by the royal governor Jonathan Belcher in 1740, and he then says, I'm going to stop this from happening at all. no banks, right? Because the banks would create a more sustainable currency. You had the loan office too, and the loan office was similar to the bank, where it would loan people on their property. You know, you're going to mortgage your mine or your factory or your land, and you get a loan. But they said, we're going to extend the Bubble Act of 1720 to suppress, quote, mischievous and dangerous undertakings. So this is what the royal governor came in and did in 1741. So he says, we're not going to allow these to happen. And that caused an uproar. People were already pissed off by having no representation, right? There were all these royal decrees from the people, limiting them from this, limiting them from that. You can't set up that. You can't set up this. No wool factory, right? So now there was an uproar against this just diktat to say you can't even go into debt to each other, because it was a right to go into debt. I mean, if people can go in debt to one another, merchants, why can't a bunch of merchants to get together and say we're going to have a means to go into debt to each other in a coordinated way? And Robert Morris says this later on. Merchants all the time, for lack of currency, would loan each other. Someone would have gold, and so everybody would loan each other that single gold, and they would all exchange promissory notes and charge each other a little bit of interest for the promissory notes for the money that they're using for that time being. And he said, why can't we do that collectively, what we do singly? And they said, no, you can't do that. So the prohibition on bills of credit continued from that 1741 against banks to then 1751. They outright said no bills of credit. So we're not even saying no banks now. We're saying in 1751 there was an act to regulate and restrain paper bills of credit in His Majesty's colonies. But this didn't have a clear language against administrative use. So if a colony really had to pay its employees, or for things that emergencies, they ended up putting on there, the distinction didn't hold. So it wasn't until 1764 that the Parliament put an act to prevent paper bills of credit hereafter to be issued in any of His Majesty's colonies from being declared illegal tender and payments of money. So that's 1764. And Ben Franklin said there in England that legislatures should be empowered to continue that. So they reversed it in 1773, and they allowed the colonies to then do that. But it was kind of too late. We were already ready to go. So in the list of complaints for the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't list interference with the bills of credit. And maybe it's because they had repealed that and said, you guys go ahead with it in 1773. So you come to the Hamilton thing. So he's reviewing this as this whole process in his final report. No well-informed man can cast a retrospective eye over the progress of the U.S. from their infancy to the present without being convinced they owe in a great degree to the fostering influence of credit. And at that time, people were, when he wrote that, people were finally convinced that it was the credit system which was going to tie the nation together as a whole too. Because there was some people who thought that we should just have gold and silver. Very few people, but they thought we should just have state. We shouldn't have a national credit system. So by the time that Hamilton was, had been the Treasury Secretary for this number of years and succeeded in setting up this the national system that would be based on the national government's credit, which everybody thought was going to be impossible because there was so much debt. He's saying we need bills of credit. And what he even ends up pushing is direct bills of credit, not just the national bank's credit, but direct Treasury notes as something that can be used to create enough circulation. If the bank can't loan, we just loan ourselves and then people pay it back in taxes. So he directly does that too. So what Hamilton's doing though is he's now basically, you take all these colonies issuing bills of credit for increase in their productivity. He's now tying together the relation between the setting up of a national government and credit. And what you end up seeing is that the purpose of the government, founding the nation itself, was tied in with how you make that credit work. So all these colonies they're trying to do that nonstop, and there's always a restriction on having means of exchange for development of industry on the one side, and then the ability to regulate the resources of the whole on the other. And that's why what you can really see is that it was the necessity for a credit system amongst states and the nation as a whole, which was the reason for and the driving force to set up the Constitution. And you see that in the papers of early letters and the papers and the Federalist Papers and so forth, but especially in the early papers of Hamilton. And so what he says is it was by restoring this public credit of the Congress that we were going to restore the nation. And he writes to various people in 1779 that there's a want of power of Congress. We're not acting like an independent nation. Our Congress is not acting according to ideas that are congruent with an independent nation, that the federal government is going to lose its authority if it doesn't change its ways. And what was happening is that the colonial bills were so depreciated. And Robert Morris makes the point that the colonial bills had been the cause of mischief, fraud, distress. The public credit was injured, perhaps beyond repair. National calamities have moved with an equal pace, and the public credit has received the deepest injury. So you're in the middle of the war. The currency had to be issued because we needed to provide and win the war. But the depreciation, because a want of union, a lack of confidence in the country, is the main thing that Hamilton cites, made it so that we were actually not going to be able to make it through the war because we were able to get less and less and less for this currency that we were emitting. Why? Because the Congress was not acting like the nation. It didn't it didn't put itself out there to demand from the states and act like a complete nation, which it had years before in the Declaration of Independence said, we claim all the powers of an independent nation. So Hamilton is lambasting these guys and saying, you have descended from the spirit of 1776. You had the implied powers. Why didn't you guys use these? And he makes this great point. We ought therefore not only to strain every nerve for complying with the requisitions to render the present campaign as decisive as possible, but we ought without delay to enlarge the powers of Congress. Every plan of which this is not the foundation will be illusory. Separate exertions of the states will never suffice. Nothing but a well-proportioned exertion of the resources of the whole under the direction of a common council with power sufficient to give efficacy to their resolutions can preserve us from being a conquered people now, or can make us a happy people hereafter. And that last part is the key, which is that nothing but a well-proportioned exertion of the resources of the whole under the single direction with the power sufficient, right? So you have to have sufficient power, coordinate the resources under a common council, can make us succeed. And he cites the Royal Council of France at that time as an idea for his bank. He writes a letter about a bank in 1779. He says we should have a national bank, and we should have the bank work with this a council of trade that will decide what to invest in. So it's the government's credit, 50%, private wealth, other 50%, and you're going to have a directed investment, direct lending, not just some monetization crap like you get with the Federal Reserve. So which powers do you need to enlarge? He's saying we got to enlarge powers. Well, we have to enlarge trade and taxation, trade between the colonies, and those. So he makes up. He writes then a series of other letters to Robert Morris, later, more concretely in 1781, on the design for a national bank. And he just makes this point that it's by introducing order into our finances, by restoring public credit, not by winning battles, that we are to finally gain our object. So this was the key thing, and Robert Morris later says that without this bank, we would not have actually won the war. So there were these 2 years after 1781 before the peace treaty, from Yorktown to the peace treaty, where without the bank we would have been destroyed because our currency would have been so depreciated, more and more trade warfare, and it would have been clear that we were bankrupt and had no plan and no unity. So what the bank did is it tied the Union together because it put all the colonies in debt at the same time to this bank by saying, we're all getting loans from this bank, the Congress, and all the states are going to pledge to pay taxes now for this national bank. Well, now that didn't exactly happen, but what it did was the action of it pushed us toward that goal, and the action of pushing us toward that goal saved the Union. And he says we never would have gotten the credit. We never would have restored our credit without this bank. Because what it did is it tied the industrious men, the men of trade, what he says, tying the means together and uniting the men of trade with the public, will, on the foundation of that incorporation and union, erect a massive credit that will supply the defect of moneyed capital and answer all the purposes of cash. So we're going to give to the merchants, and people want to loan, because we were borrowing money from the government, the other governments around the world. Our own states weren't giving us any loans for this war. So in order to make it the loan worthwhile and not just have it be sunk into immediate payments to get us through one more year of the war, he said the way we solve that problem is we create a fund for circulating credit, and it will make the investments in commerce more profitable to these merchants because it's going to be united with this bank than it would be for themselves to invest in trade. And it'll secure them the independence of the nation. So advantages analogous to those they received by employing their money in trade, and eventually greater advantages because you're living in this country and your whole country is going to succeed and progress, and you're going to be able to make even more profit through productivity and production. So this is going to be the key. And he has a whole lot of things on here, but his main point is that the bank will supply the defective circulating medium, and it will transfer all these depreciated bills of credit that were going around as continentals with a currency that was going to be tied to production. And the point that production should determine the amount of currency, the quantity of labor, as Hamilton said, Ben Franklin said before, not the amount of gold and silver. The credit bank allows that, because if you just issue bills of credit with a Congress that doesn't even have the powers to raise taxes, those are simply it's what Ben Franklin called them was a tax on the people, because you're never making good on those bills, and there's nothing, and the lack of confidence more and more means that everybody's accepting more and more of them for the same amount of goods. They're getting less and less value, and so you can see the abuse that ended up happening. But the main abuse was the lack of government power, so that these congressional bills of credit were not actually representative of a government. They were just the Congress that was not assured success. So the bank gave that assured success. So he makes the point, industry is increased, commodities are multiplied, agriculture and manufactures flourish, and herein consists the true wealth and prosperity of the state. And that is the purpose of the bank, to do that, which is then how you get more and more wealth for the country. And that was clear from Hamilton, all the way through to the manufacturer's report, that technology was the key. So what he really showed with this bank was that it was the intention of the leadership at that time to create a currency where it's a reflection of trade, not the fact that he got a loan from France to make the bank work, that defined a currency. The value of the currency is not the amount of gold in the bank, but the value of the currency was that it was now going to be funded by the growth of commerce and industry. So you're getting a direct correlation now between a currency and the physical production that you have. And so that was what was going to make it work, was that it'd be funded by an increased growth in trade. So he makes that point very clearly in his letters to Robert Morris here. And he says this is going to be a solid, permanent paper credit, as he says elsewhere too. And that it would be a cement of the Union because you could put all the states in debt through organizing a national debt. So now, as I said, it didn't quite turn out the way that he wanted, because it quickly became a state bank, because you didn't have the powers of the Congress to actually raise those taxes that you need to make the whole thing work. Because if the bank was going to have as its capital the public debt, as people putting in their bills, their continental bills, now being subscribers to this bank, as he does later, you'd have to have those powers. So finally he gets to do this later on, right? Almost 10 years later. He finally does what he wanted to do in 1781, by winning the Constitutional Convention, by winning the fact that it happened. So, but in the meantime, this does provide the great capstone on this whole process, which is that Robert Morris comes out and defines to people what this bank actually does. And it does the same things that it does later in 1790. And he says that, like we had with William Potter and John Winthrop and these guys before, right, a lack of exchange. He says, now that we had a bank, this is Robert Morris, now that we had a bank who, and he was the guy who was running the colonial office, and he was the financier of the Continental Congress. He says, this bank creates a situation where now money is available because the bank furnished its notes to the merchants in exchange for their obligations, and the notes served as money with which they paid for their purchases. Directly what you have all the way through Hamilton's credit system is that the bank is simply it's basically creating a currency equal to people's promissory notes, so that it's the intention of merchants, farmers, manufacturers to have agreements with each other, and the bank comes in as the authority that can, what you call, monetize, or simply turn that into a credit agreement. There's no necessity for capital in the bank for that to be the case. You just have promissory note between the miller, the guy who makes flour, and the guy who makes the bread. And one guy says, I'm going to make good, I'll have promised to pay you later. And then the guy brings that promissory note to the bank, and the bank will issue its debt in notes to the miller, say, and then that guy can now use those notes and go do something with it, instead of sitting around with the promissory note that he got from the baker. And so in the meantime, he can do something with these notes. The bank makes a slight profit because the guy who comes back later to pay his the initial promissory note, then he has to pay a little extra. So what it's doing is just taking credit agreement between two transactions that it will increase the value of something, a raw material to a finished good, flour into bread. And in the meantime that process is occurring, it's allowing for an equal amount of credit in the economy. So the notes. So what you're looking at is that this idea of discount, right? A bank discounting a promissory note, creating money supply, creating a credit supply, is simply one that is going to be equal to the demand in the economy. Not supply and demand, Adam Smith, but productive demand. So you get that. This is what really the the credit system is all about. And so in 1781, we now had a bank that could do that. And Robert Morris said before that, you just had all these farmers showing up, and by the end of the day, they'd go home with their goods because no one could sell any of their goods because there was just no money supply. Whereas before, instead, you have a farmer meets up with a manufacturer, right? And what these two guys do is they write a bill of exchange together, and then they go to the bank, and the bank will issue the money supply to make that transaction happen. So that's what the bank could do. And it didn't need any extra money to do that. It needed the authority to exist. And as we can see with this history of the colonies, the authority of that bank finally existing was based on Hamilton and these guys just saying we have the authority to do it, in the face of, right, these royal governors who before they said no, you can't do that. And the reason they didn't want them to do that is because they wanted to stay as a feudal system. They didn't want them to be independent. So now finally, where we've declared a Congress, we've got a young genius and Robert Morris, and they say, hey, that thing we couldn't do back in 1696, the thing we couldn't do back in 1740, well, now we can do it here, where we're simply going to create a bank that can create enough payment system. So that's really what it is. You're just creating a payment system so that all the different groups can work together. And Robert Morris writes in a very illustrative way, he says, the credit that had been extended by the importer to the country shopkeeper, and through him to the farmer mechanic, who being thereby enabled to pursue their labors, had drawn produce from the surface and bowels of the earth, which has not only defrayed the whole of the costs and charges, but enriched the industrious. So you lose the cost of not having money, which is all the problem with barter. But people who want to do something, now you're enabled to do it. So all the farmers can now sell their goods because you've created a payment system by the authority of government to do that. And this is what you get later, actually, with all the way Stephen Caldwell, Lincoln's economist, who's attacking the gold-silver system that Jackson and Van Buren imposed. Is he's just saying people always wanted to use these banks because the bank would simply create enough payment, create the means of payment. He wrote a book on the means of payment equal to the real valid promissory notes between farmers, bills of exchange, and which are really also just bills of credit. The bills of credit were, through the government. The bills of exchange were between individual merchants. So this authority, however, was not followed through on until the Constitution. That 1781 bank didn't work, and we didn't have the powers of Congress. But once we got the powers of Congress, Hamilton finally did what he wanted to do, was just take all these public credit, the debt, and in 3 acts of Congress on August 4th, 9th, and 12th of 1790, as Treasury Secretary, Hamilton put through the public credit and then the National Bank Act, and then turned all that, the public debt, into the medium of commerce, the medium of exchange, all then an order of magnitude more than the amount of gold that existed in the colony at that time. There was 1 million in specie, and Hamilton created a bank with 10 million in capital, which was the public debt. So now he's increasing this means of exchange by an order of magnitude than was in gold and silver, and allowed for people to move the country around. And Robert Morris had already said earlier, a due provision for the public debts would at once convert these debts into a real medium of commerce. In an earlier letter before he resigned, when in the midst of this issue where the colonies wouldn't pay any taxes or do anything, he resigned because he was sitting as the colonial officer, unable to make good on anybody's credit. He's borrowing money, and he goes bankrupt for the nation because nobody would back up the Congress. And he's saying, I am the Congress, basically. And he said, payments of debts may be expensive, but it is infinitely more expensive to withhold payment. The former is an expense of money, when money is commanded to defray, but the latter involves the destruction of that source from whence money can be derived when all other sources fail. That source nay, almost inexhaustible, abundant is public credit. And they really meant, they meant not public credit as just borrowing gold from people. They meant public credit by saying you're going to, make good on something. And so with this, now Hamilton echoes Robert Morris earlier, but from a higher standpoint. He says, in a sound and settled state of the public funds, a man possessed of a sum of them can embrace any scheme of business which offers with as much confidence as if he were possessed of an equal sum of coin. And you go all the way back, right, to the Winthrops. They're making the same point. So now that we've committed, we've got the government, we can make good on the public debt. Now he's using the powers of Congress. Now the public credit is a currency that everybody will use. So the funded debt, but that's his point. The public funds, meaning the public debt, in a sound state of them, when we're funding them, people are paying taxes. You're using manufacturers and industry, and the duty payments on this stuff, you're channeling it toward the payment of interest on the public debt. That system with these acts of Congress made the situation where this debt was all tied to the future. It was not a debt in the Treasury that we were just, making cuts to pay off. But that system created a funded debt. And that debt now became an asset. And it became as valuable as if it was gold. So it was his action in creating that system, which actually, as I said, increased in order of magnitude the productivity of the country. So he says, though a funded debt is not an absolute increase of capital or an augmentation of real wealth, yet by serving as a new power in the operation of industry, it has within certain bounds a tendency to increase the real wealth of the community. Public credit is among the principal engines of useful enterprise and internal improvement, as the substitute for capital is little less useful than gold or silver in agriculture and commerce and the manufacturing and mechanic arts. One man wishes to take up and cultivate a piece of land. He purchases upon credit, and in time pays the purchase money out of the produce of the soil improved by his labor. So you're going to go into debt, right? You're going to get credit. You're going to pay it back later with your productivity in the farm. Another sets up in trade. In the credit founded upon a fair character, he seeks and often finds the means of becoming, at length, a wealthy merchant. A third commences business as a manufacturer mechanic, with skill but without money. It is by credit that he is enabled to procure the tools, the materials, and even the subsistence of which he stands in need, until his industry has supplied him with capital. And even then he derives from an established and increased credit the means of extending his undertakings. And this was, what the people who attacked Jackson for destroying the credit system were saying in his times, that we would continue to go into debt but be productive. This is not the poor debtors, that are all we're just spending money. These were all the enterprising people who wanted to move ahead. So it was the right of the people at that time to go into debt, and the right of the people to go into debt, and the right of the people to be industrious. That was equivalent. The right to go into debt, the right to be industrious, the right to improve your labor. This is why also the credit system is part of the Constitution, because without you can't actually uphold equal rights if you don't have a credit system, because you don't create in the means for people to move forward. If you don't have credit and you just have a money system, it's basically keeping people fixed, because they don't have the means to go into debt. It's a different kind of debt. It's not. These were all the guys that wanted to borrow something from these banks, were people who wanted to be industrious. So that is, the different view at that time than people have now. But that is exactly the case. So with this system, Hamilton made a point where, we just abandoned gold and silver almost entirely. 99% of all value was transferred by bank credit, and 99.9% of all transactions were made in bank credit. So that was what ended up happening. And all of the saving by not having gold could go directly into economic activity, because otherwise, people have to sell their goods for gold and then use the gold to buy other goods, versus they can just directly transport their goods for other goods and not have to liquidate a lot of their wealth just to get the money to buy other things. So all of that saving, people made the point, could go directly into increasing economic activity even further. So it's a huge saving of what he created, far more than probably an order of magnitude, which then makes the point that he created more wealth than had he just canceled the debt. So had we just canceled our 60 million debt, we would have been less wealthy had we lost the debt than we continued in this 60 million debt, but turned that debt into an asset. So he changed the meaning of debt, right? Debt was redefined as, debt to the future, that it was basically now not a self-evident object, but the means to move forward and not pay back in simple money, but was the process of unifying the resources of the nation and finalizing that inherent principle of credit that went all the way back to Massachusetts Bay. So in conclusion, just point out that this was really the purpose, the understanding that the means of credit is not the money itself. The currency becomes not money itself, but the means and the spirit of enterprise. And that goes all the way back to what Cotton Mather thought about currency, Ben Franklin, and that the whole purpose of it was to create this means of enterprise, to increase the productive powers of labor, and that it's the process itself. The innovations that take place in getting loans from the credit system, improving the cost of production, transportation, that surplus is what then has to be managed. And way Hamilton managed the credit system as Treasury Secretary then became something which he's always looking towards a surplus. He was never ever looking at cutting something to appease a debtor, but he's looking at diverting surpluses always to get a physical break-even point. Now we're going to have to manage it exactly the way he did if we're going to at all make the U.S. economy in a state where we could come out of this mess. We're going to have to regulate the whole system with an eye scientifically looking at our economy as a physical system, and that of course we have to bankrupt Wall Street and the speculators and wipe out all that phony money, because otherwise there's no good way to do it. There's no good way of tracking what your physical productivity is as it's represented in the financial system. So if we're going to organize a real credit system, we have to have full control, as Hamilton did, over all the different taxes, the manufacturing, the application of the government credit to things, and know exactly what's going to, if not exactly, but a good estimate on how much productivity it will generate by application of it. So it's literally from the future. The credit literally comes from the future, and that's why a lot of people couldn't understand it. Then it was hard for a lot of people to understand, because you're actually creating new wealth, which people generally who are fixed. They're not thinking about improving things. They're not thinking about moving to a new paradigm. They don't think about credit. So look, this is the point. We've gone this far now. We should use these powers of the government, and we have to fully rediscover them as the way these guys did. They had the authority before the authority existed in paper. Right? They declared independence before we were fully independent. Hamilton set up a credit system without any money at all, without the full authority even of the Constitution to do it. And then when he got the powers, he went all the way. So it's men of this character that have to be channeled now. We don't have the kind of people that are willing to just say, we have the authority to provide for our population. without any of your so-called money. Because it's the same issue again today, where it may not be gold and silver, it's still people got who has the money and who don't have the money. So we have to bankrupt these guys and use the authority that we have in this country, this whole legacy. So I would invite people to further study the credit system page and our 3-point program to see the importance of instituting the credit system immediately. And that's the real purpose for Glass-Steagall.